I will be introducing Professor Mark Edwards, who is the Associate Dean at the Divinity School, who will be speaking about the Paul Tillich Lectures as a series. And after that, I will be introducing my colleague in the philosophy department, Professor Christine Korsgaard, who will be introducing our speaker today, Professor Richard Schacht. So, Professor Edwards.
I wanted to welcome you to this co-sponsored event on behalf of the Divinity School. The Tillich Lectures began in 1990. They occur twice a year. There's a description on the back of your program. A number of very distinguished people have spoken in this series, and we are proud now to be associated with the Tillich series. University professor Paul Tillich was appointed at Harvard in 1954, but began, as is often true, he had a year's leave before he started. It began in 1955. And my understanding is he taught in this very room, or something very close to this very room, his various lectures. As a university professor, he was allowed to roam around. He taught in the Divinity School. He taught in the Department of Philosophy. He taught in the general education. And I think that his final term, spring 1962, he taught a course in the philosophy of religion. So this was a Renaissance man at a time when the Divinity School was being revived. There was interchange between the Yard and the Divinity School, and it's a very happy time in our history, and I hope it's a time, although without Professor Tillich, that's now being revived through the Tillich Lectures. And I particularly want to thank Bill Kraut, who was responsible. His diligence, his hard work, his enthusiasm have made these lectures possible. So thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Richard Schacht back here in Emerson Hall after some years of absence. And happily here to introduce him today is a former student of his, former chair of this department, Professor Christine Korsgaard.
Thank you, Dick. It's a great pleasure to introduce Richard Schacht to you. Dick was an undergraduate philosophy concentrator here at Harvard, as you've just heard, where, among other things, he studied with Paul Tillich and with John Rawls. He did his graduate work at Princeton, working with Walter Kaufmann. He joined the Department of Philosophy at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1967, and he is currently Professor of Philosophy and Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences there. On top of being a superb teacher and a productive scholar, he has tirelessly served the University of Illinois in 2 long stints as chair of the philosophy department, as chair of the University Senate, as an interim dean, and in many other capacities. Dick has worked in a wide-ranging way on European philosophy, mostly of the 19th and 20th centuries, but as some earlier modern philosophy as well, on philosophical anthropology, social theory, and the theory of value. One focus of his work has been Nietzsche, whom he's going to talk about today. Besides numerous essays, Dick has written 2 books about Nietzsche, one entitled Nietzsche in 1983, and another, Making Sense of Nietzsche, an examination and response to recent debates about the interpretation of Nietzsche in 1995. He's played a constant leading role in the North American Nietzsche Society and edited a number of collections dealing with Nietzsche's work. He's also written on Hegelian and Marxist themes in Alienation, and more recently in The Future of Alienation, and has published a series of clear and interesting studies of modern philosophers in his 2 books, Classical Modern Philosophers, Descartes to Kant, and Hegel and After, Studies in Continental Philosophy Between Kant and Sartre. Just last year, Dick and Philip Kitcher published Finding an Ending, a co-authored study of philosophical themes in Wagner's Ring Circle. Among other projects, Dick is currently the general editor of the projected 5-volume Norton Anthology of Western Philosophy. I myself met Dick a little over 30 years ago when I transferred to the University of Illinois from Eastern Illinois University in search of a more sophisticated and challenging philosophy program. I certainly found it. Among the many excellent opportunities the program provided me was the chance to study European philosophy and philosophical anthropology with Dick Schacht. Dick is a model teacher, both in his meticulous course preparation and in the attention he's willing to bestow on his students, and it's largely through his influence that I have a sense of what sort of a difference a teacher can make in an undergraduate's life. He played a large role in encouraging me to try for a career in philosophy and has been a continuous supporter ever since. And it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to thank him publicly for that and to learn from him again this afternoon as I have so often in the past. Dick's lecture for today is entitled After the Death of God, Friedrich Nietzsche and Paul Tillich. Join me in welcoming him.
I have to remember to turn on the lavalier. Thank you very much, Chris and Dick and all. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Bill Kraut for the invitation to deliver this year's Tillich lecture, and to the University Marshal's Office, the Divinity School, and the Department of Philosophy for their sponsorship of this event. This occasion, as you might imagine, is a very meaningful one for me for many reasons. I took quite a few courses in this very room, and that includes the course that Paul Tillich taught in his last year here, the Philosophy of Religion course that was just mentioned. And it was my relationship with Tillich that makes this an especially meaningful opportunity and occasion. He was only here for 2 of my years as an undergraduate. He was not here my freshman year, but he was here my sophomore and junior year, after which he left to go to Chicago. And in the 2 years in which I had him as a teacher and as an educator, he profoundly influenced the direction of my philosophical life. I took his Philosophy of Religion course, but I also took the 4-semester course in the self-interpretation of man in Western thought, which is an incredible educational experience. It began at the beginning of my sophomore year and concluded at the end of my junior year and was the centerpiece of my undergraduate education. It began with the pre-Socratics and ended with the existentialists, and it didn't skip anything in between. So many philosophers, so little time. And yet, even though there were only 2 lectures a week and we were moving at a great pace, Tillich managed to make all of us feel that we actually understood all of that, which is a great illusion, but nonetheless it was a great feeling. It was in the last part of the 4th semester of that course, after dealing with classical modern philosophy from Descartes to Kant, that Tillich introduced me to Hegel, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. No one in the philosophy department here in those days would have touched any of them with a 10-foot pole. So I never would have found out about them if it hadn't been for Tillich, or if I had, it couldn't possibly have been from anyone who would have made them come alive for me the way he did. He turned me on to them, and I've been turned on to them ever since, Hegel and Nietzsche in particular. I can't resist adding a footnote for the amusement of any of you who may have known Walter Kaufmann or known about him, who I went to study with after my undergraduate years at Princeton. I went to Princeton mainly because Kaufmann was there, less because Princeton was one of the best departments in the country and a hotbed of analytical philosophy, but it was in those latter respects that Princeton did me the most good. But I did benefit from my association there with Kaufmann as well. And so some years later, I decided to try to express my gratitude to both Kaufmann and Tillich by dedicating my second book that Chris mentioned, Hegel and After, as follows. To the memory of Paul Tillich, who showed me where to look, and to Walter Kaufmann, who showed me how to see, or taught me how to see. Well, I thought that was kind of nice, to sort of finessing things, but Kaufman was not happy about it at all. He was miffed at having to share the dedication with anybody, let alone Tillich, for whom he had really no great esteem. I was figured that he would react in that way, but I really wanted to do it anyhow, and I wanted to say it in print because, in his way, Tillich was as important to me as Kaufman was, and without Tillich was something like my sine qua non for the trajectory that my philosophical career ultimately took. Tillich died nearly 40 years ago. Like Nietzsche, about whom I'll also be talking today, he is now history. Yet Tillich and Nietzsche both remain spiritually contemporary to me and remain of contemporary significance to anyone who seeks to grapple with the kinds of issues they did. One of those large issues is that of whether there is some sort of conception of God and some kind of religiousness that is deserving of a human future beyond what Nietzsche called the death of God. That is to be my topic today. But before I get into it, there are a few things about the two of them that are worth mentioning to set the stage a bit. Nietzsche and Tillich were cut from similar cloth. Both were born and raised in what is now the eastern part of Germany, in small and quite provincial communities. They were not that far apart in age. Only 42 years separated their births. Both of their fathers were Lutheran ministers. They both outgrew the conservative faith of their fathers. Tillich continued to embrace the name and essence of Christianity as he reinterpreted it, while Nietzsche came to despise what he called by that name. But the reinterpreted version of Christianity that Tillich developed bears little resemblance to the Christianity that so appalled Nietzsche. And anti-Christian though he proclaimed himself to be, Nietzsche was one of Tillich's heroes, as Tillich made clear in his 2,500-year epic saga of the history of philosophy as told in Hum 141. Tillich's high regard for Nietzsche is reflected in the fact that he mentions Nietzsche more often than almost any other philosopher in his various writings, either making common cause with him or using him to set up a point in a way that takes him very seriously. Tillich considered existentialism to be the dominant philosophical sensibility of our time. That is back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I guess just 60s. And he regarded Nietzsche as one of its great inspirations, whose importance also transcended existentialism. He sought to develop a theology that would give contemporary expression to what he took to be the truth of Christianity, and that also would be compelling as a response to the challenge posed by existentialism's seemingly radically anti-religious sensibility. It was also intended to be a response to Nietzsche, who gave vivid expression to that challenge, and whom Tillich considered actually to be far from anti-religious. Tillich sought to give both Nietzsche and existentialism their due, and yet to maintain that there is something important in Christianity that does not stand and fall with the God proclaimed by Nietzsche to be dead. Existentialism has long since ceased to be a literary and philosophical expression of the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist, for better or for worse, has moved on. But Nietzsche remains an intellectual and philosophical force to be reckoned with, far more so, in fact, in the Anglo-American philosophical community than was the case in the 60s and 70s, when he was not even taken seriously as a philosopher, except as an insidious influence and corrupter of youth. Tillich knew better and cared because he knew that Nietzsche was on to something important, both critically and constructively, on many matters, some of which had to do with religion, religiousness, and the idea of God. Tillich saw Nietzsche as a thinker who was rightly forcing these issues in a way that was fundamentally constructive, not only philosophically but also religiously, even as he also considered Nietzsche's own position to be deficient. And that deficiency was not Nietzsche's rejection of what might be called the God hypothesis. On that score, they both are basically on the same page. For Tillich is as dismissive of theism, or belief in the existence of a divine superbeing, as is Nietzsche. They are both, so to speak, post-theistic. The God whose death Nietzsche proclaimed is not the one Tillich affirms. Whether Tillich is affirming anything that Nietzsche would want to deny is a more difficult and interesting question, as is the question of what distinguishes Nietzsche's own sort of religiousness from that which Tillich ultimately favors and calls absolute faith. I will be considering both of these questions. The epigraph for my lecture, which I am about to begin, although you may have thought that I've already begun, is something Nietzsche wrote in one of his late notebooks toward the end of his productive life. Here it is. Now remember, this is Nietzsche. And how many new gods are still possible? As for myself, in whom the religious, that is to say, God-forming instinct, occasionally becomes active at impossible times, how differently, how variously the divine has revealed itself to me each time. End of the quotation. If you know anything at all about Nietzsche, you know that he rejects the idea of a transcendent deity existing before and above and beyond this life and world. The idea of such a God is an idea whose time, he says, has come and gone, having become unbelievable, as he puts it in The Gay Science, in explanation of his proclamation that God is dead. Nietzsche knew full well that there are a great many people for whom that idea is still alive and well, and who could not bear to give it up. But that, for him, did not have anything to do with the credibility of the idea, and did not render it any less urgent to get on with the task of a de-deified interpretation and revaluation of ourselves and morality and everything else about this life and this world. To fail to pursue that task, he believed, would render us all the more vulnerable to a debilitating and disastrous nihilistic reaction when the death of God sinks in. For we have been taught to think that where meaning and value and morality and authority and human worth and everything else of importance are concerned, it is God or bust. If God does not exist, goes the refrain, nothing matters. But that, for Nietzsche, is the greatest of mistakes. So he champions the enhancement and affirmation of this life and this world, and the idea of a new, stronger, healthier, and more mature type of human being. A creative spirit, he writes, who will redeem us not only from the hitherto reigning ideal, that is, otherworldly, God-centered religiousness, but also from that which was bound to grow out of it, the great nausea, the will to nothingness, nihilism. That's from Genealogy of Morals, second essay, section 24. This is not Tillich's form of rhetorical style and appeal. But Tillich, too, was convinced of the necessity of dispensing with the idea of God as a kind of supreme being, which he believes misrepresents the fundamental reality of the divine, and only serves to hinder any true sense of it. Tillich strove to give the idea of God a new lease on life, but for him, if that new lease is to hold up, it requires the reinterpretation of the idea of God, transforming it into the idea of what he called the God above God. And this God above God is nothing like a supreme being. That idea of God, for Tillich as for Nietzsche, is a misunderstanding as a conceptualization of the divine. So Tillich writes in his discussion of the reality of God in the first volume of Systematic Theology, quoting, "Ordinary theism has made God a heavenly, completely perfect person who resides above the world and mankind. The protest of atheism against such a person is correct. There is no evidence for his existence, nor is he a matter of ultimate concern." Unquote. Tillich's God above God is no being of any sort, and cannot be said to exist at all. To talk about the existence of God for Tillich is a kind of category mistake, akin to talking about the gender of God, only worse. The question of the existence of God, Tillich writes, can neither be asked nor answered. He continues, It is as atheistic to affirm the existence of God as it is to deny it. God is being itself, not a being." Unquote. In short, Tillich is saying the reality of God should not be conceived as the existence of a being, however great and perfect, even though that is precisely how God has been and continues to be conceived by most people who think of themselves as believing in God. Tillich disparages the same commonplace idea of God in The Courage to Be. There he writes, quote, "God is seen as a self which has a world, as an ego which is related to a thou, as a cause which is separated from its effect, as having a definite space and an endless time. He is conceived as a being, not, as he should be, as being itself." Here too, in the place of this idea of God, Tillich champions the idea of the God above the God of theism, as he puts it there. It is God conceived as being itself that is said to be the content of absolute faith, as well as, quoting again, the ultimate source of the courage to be. In this way, Tillich is able to take Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God in stride, and even to endorse it as a prelude to a religiousness that does not involve and revolve around belief in the existence of God as any sort of being at all. Tillich rightly takes Nietzsche's conception of the death of God to convey more than what he calls, Tillich, the atheistic or naturalistic criticism of the theistic idea of God. He grants that Nietzsche does accept that criticism. He sees Nietzsche as having further meant that, as Tillich writes, God is dead as far as man's consciousness of him is concerned. Or, as he also puts it, that in man the consciousness of an ultimate, in the traditional sense, has died. And further, Nietzsche also meant, quoting Tillich again, that when the traditional idea of God falls, something else must fall along with it, namely, the system of ethical values on which society is based, that is associated with that belief. But the crux of the matter for Nietzsche is the bankruptcy of the idea of God in what Tillich here calls the traditional sense, existing somewhere on high and playing a variety of active roles affecting us in this world and the next. Tillich agrees with Nietzsche that this idea is untenable. He does remark in the same discussion of Nietzsche that, quoting Tillich, "the idea that God in himself is dead would be absurd." What makes it absurd, however, is the fact that if taken literally, it would imply that God once was actually alive and then actually died, which would be equally absurd for the simple reason that God, for Tillich, is not the name of a being that could be literally either alive or dead. The historical Jesus, of course, is a different matter. Tillich does want to maintain that there is an important sense in which, as he puts it, the God of the tradition is still alive, if this claim is given a proper symbolic interpretation, as he likes to say. And he contends that the symbolic point relates to what distinguishes his own conception of the God above God from Nietzsche's, and his Christianity from what he calls Nietzsche's ecstatic naturalism. But how do they differ, since the difference cannot be expressed in terms of anything like the existence of God and belief in God, conceived in the traditional sense? The difference may not be as great as one might suppose. Let us take a closer look at what Tillich has to say about this God above God and see what we can find. The word God, Tillich states, is the name for that which concerns man ultimately. Or rather, it is the name of that which is worthy and deserving of our ultimate concern. Its proper and appropriate focus, as it were. But what is that? Tillich never tires of telling us it is being itself, unhyphenated, or being itself, hyphenated. Quoting him, "The being of God cannot be understood as the existence of a being alongside others or above others," he writes. "The being of God is being itself." But what is being itself if it is neither the existence of a being nor the existence of the totality of all beings? Tillich offers a hint when he goes on to give a kind of gloss on this notion. He writes, "Many confusions in the doctrine of God could be avoided if God were understood first of all as being itself or as the ground of being. But what is the ground of being, if it is not itself a being of a special sort, as the God who supposedly created the world is usually conceived to be? Tillich offers the following answer to this question. The power of being, he writes, is another way of expressing the same thing in a circumscribing phrase. In other words, he continues, God conceived as the ground of being, quoting again, is the power of being in everything and above everything, the infinite power of being. Unquote. If this is what Tillich means by God, then it makes perfect sense for him to deny that God is to be conceived as a being that either does or does not exist. Because something conceived as the power of being in everything cannot itself be a being. There is more, even if also less, to the reality of such a power than there is to existing as any particular being or sort of being. And it is precisely this more, for Tillich, in which the transcendence of the God whose reality he is discussing consists. So he goes on to say, quoting, as the power of being, God transcends every being, and also the totality of beings, the world. Being itself infinitely transcends every finite being. Not as another being, but as the power of being. This is so, however, not because being itself exists as an almighty superbeing above and beyond all particular existing beings, but rather because it is something like their ultimate principle. So one might assert with equally good reason that living itself, or the power of living, also transcends every particular living creature. And that the power of living transcends every living creature and also the totality of living creatures. There's parallel constructions to the ones that he uses with respect to being itself and the power of being. Yet Tillich does have something further in mind that sets him apart from Nietzsche. And the notion of being itself as the ground and power of being is intended by Tillich to suggest it. Here is Tillich on Nietzsche. If you want to find out about his idea of God, Tillich writes, do not look first to his statement that God is dead. Read instead the last fragments of The Will to Power. The last fragment describes the divine demonic character of life in formulations which show the ambiguity, the greatness, and the destructiveness of life. He then asks us to affirm this life in its great ambiguity. Out of this, he then has another kind of God. A God in which the demonic underground, the Dionysian underground, is clearly visible. The victory of the element of rationality or of meaning is not as clear as in other philosophers like Kant or Hegel. But there is an opening up of the vitality and its half-creative, half-destructive power. End of the quotation. The key to getting God right that Nietzsche misses, Tillich seems to be saying, has to do something with this idea of the victory of the element of rationality or of meaning. It is worth noting, however, that Tillich does not assert that that Nietzsche is oblivious to the importance of the element of rationality or meaning. He merely says that Nietzsche is less clearly committed to the idea of their victory than others are, and than Tillich himself, presumably is. I'll come back to these points. That's true enough, but it's not a world of difference between Tillich and Nietzsche. In any event, here is the fragment in question that Tillich is referring to, which you ought to have in mind with Tillich having said that, and as we go forward. Tillich chose well. It is a quite remarkable and eloquent statement, even if Nietzsche didn't actually publish it. It's from his notebooks. And do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end, a fixed and firm quantity of energy that becomes neither larger nor smaller, that is not consumed but rather only transformed. A sea of forces raging and surging within itself, eternally changing, eternally running back again, with tremendous years of recurrence, with an ebb and a flow of its forms. Out of the simplest surging into the most complex, out of the stillest, stiffest, coldest, into the hottest, wildest, most self-contradictory, and then homewardly returning to the simple again, out of this fullness. out of the play of contradictions back to the pleasure of concord, affirming itself as that which must return eternally, as a becoming that knows no satiety, no disgust, no weariness. This, my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating and eternally self-destroying, this mystery world of the twofold ecstasy, this, my beyond good and evil, without a goal, unless the joy of the circle is itself a goal, without will, unless a ring has good will toward itself. Do you want a name for this world? A solution for all its mysteries? A light for you two, you best hidden, strongest, most dauntless, most midnightly ones? This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, and nothing besides. That's the end of the passage. And it's will to power fragment 1067, and I'm going to refer to it subsequently as 1067. So when I say 1067, it's not the year after William landed in Britain. It's this fragment that I'm talking about. Tillich is right. This is a vision that deserves to be called religious. In this note, Nietzsche powerfully articulates his version of what Tillich calls the power of being, and of the manner of its eternal expression. And it presents this reality as something divine, even if it is a conception of the divine that includes within itself an element that Tillich deems demonic. If Nietzsche has something like a God in Tillich's God above God sense, this is it. Tillich seeks to differentiate his version from Nietzsche's by drawing attention to the prominence Nietzsche gives to the demonic, destructive character of the power he is describing. But this may be a distinction without all that much of a difference, since Nietzsche is only claiming that we are confronted here with two very deep sides of the same fundamental coin, and since Tillich himself takes the very same position. For the power of being, for Tillich, is both the creative ground, Grund, and the abyss, Abgrund, of all finite beings, ourselves included. Tillich puts these notions all together as follows. Now this is Tillich. In calling being itself creative, we point to the fact that everything participates in the power of being. In calling it abysmal, we point to the fact that everything participates in the power of being in a finite way, that is, must perish. That all beings are infinitely transcended by their creative ground. Nietzsche can and does say pretty much the same thing, in language that is not all that different. Like Tillich's being itself and power of being, Nietzsche's notions of becoming and will to power are not to be reified and conceived as beings or entities that exist in the manner of particular beings at all. Rather, they too have to do with what it purportedly means to be, and so with the basic character of the all-encompassing reality in which all finite forms of existence come to be, have their being, and cease to be. In that sense, moreover, and it would seem to be precisely Tillich's sense, Nietzsche too could, if he wished, speak here of the transcendence of becoming as the ceaseless play of will to power, precisely because it is the name of the game itself rather than of anything or everything that plays it. Nietzsche might be thought of as deifying becoming itself, as elaborated in 1067. And that may appear to contrast strikingly with Tillich's conception of God as being itself. But does it? Nietzsche speaks of becoming rather than of being precisely because, like Tillich, he too wants to get away from the idea that the ground of all that is and goes on in the world has the character of a being, an ultimate or absolute thing or entity or object or subject of some sort. Reality for Nietzsche is rather to be conceived most fundamentally in terms of what goes on and how it goes on, as 1067 makes vividly clear. And something very much like that would seem to be the case for Tillich as well. It is revealing that, like Nietzsche, Tillich makes much of the idea of power and of the power of being. For what he is talking about at this level of discourse is not power as something various people and creatures happen to have and to exert, but rather as something about the fundamental nature of what it is and means to be. Quoting Tillich, "Being must be thought as the negation of being," he writes, continuing, "That is why we describe being best by the metaphor power. Power is the possibility a being has to actualize itself against the resistance of other beings." Now this may not be straight Nietzsche, but it is at least in the same neighborhood. Power, for Tillich, as for Nietzsche, is at least partially definitive of all reality, vitality, humanity, creativity, spirituality, and indeed of divinity, as their animating ground, to use Tillich's word, even if it is also their abyss, to use another, and admits of demonically destructive expressions, to use a third. Tillich would seem at last to be moving clearly beyond Nietzsche when he sounds the Christian themes of personalism and love, for there certainly is nothing personal about the picture Nietzsche describes in 1067, and nothing loving about it either toward us as particular individuals. But the same would seem to be true of Tillich's being itself, which is no heavenly perfect person, as Tillich explicitly states. In The Courage to Be, Tillich says that personalism with respect to God is balanced by a transpersonal presence of the divine. But it turns out that he really means superseded by, because in systematic theology, he flatly states, quote, "Personal God does not mean that God is a person," unquote. What then does it mean? Only this, quoting again, "It means that God," that is, being itself, "is the ground of everything personal, and so carries the ontological power of personality," unquote. But this is just to say that being itself makes personality possible. That is, it allows for the possibility of personality under the right conditions. And that is nothing that Nietzsche would deny, since he makes much of the possibility of personality himself, even if he does so in the more naturalistic language of what he calls genealogy. The situation is essentially the same with respect to love. God is love, Tillich writes, pointedly not saying that God loves each and every one of us. For to be able to do that, God would have to be a kind of heavenly person, which he is not. What Tillich does go on to say is this, quote, "Since God is being itself, one might say that being itself is love, and that the process of the divine life has the character of love." Tillich thus is making 2 points about God and love. First, that being itself is such as to allow for the possibility of love as well as of personality, which is another very fine thing indeed about being itself. And second, that something like love is a pervasive feature of the way in which being itself, as the creative ground of being, elaborates itself. That's what Tillich calls the divine life. But Nietzsche thinks so too. In fact, he makes as much of love as anyone in the history of philosophy, not only in its rudimentary forms, but also in its various cultivated and intensified sublimations and transformations. If Tillich and Nietzsche part company in their conceptions of the divine, therefore, it is not here either. Yet Tillich contends that they do part. He maintains that Nietzsche, quote, "has a different God than the God of the religious tradition, especially of the Christian tradition." This is certainly true. But the same could be said of Tillich, so that by itself does not establish either that or how the two of them differ. Nietzsche's God, Tillich goes on to say, unlike that of the Christian tradition, is, in the passage I read a few moments ago, the divine demonic being which he called life. But that is not quite right in a crucial respect. What Nietzsche is evoking in 1067 is not simply a being which he called life, even though what he calls the affirmation of life is the fundamental expression of his kind of religiousness. Rather, Nietzsche is talking about the basic character of all of reality, life included, just as Tillich is attempting to do in talking about being itself. The difference between the two of them, such as it may be, must have to do with something about what they take that basic character to be. Tillich suggests at least one problem with deifying what he describes as vitality and its half-creative, half-destructive power, as he takes Nietzsche to be doing, in that it does not give due prominence to what Tillich calls the element of rationality or meaning. This element of coherent meaningfulness is the key to Tillich's rather Hegelian interpretation of the idea of spirit, and so also of what it means to talk about God as spirit. Life as spirit is Tillich writes, life as spirit is the inclusive symbol for the divine life. Spirit, again quoting, is the power through which meaning lives, and is the meaning which gives direction to power. This, for Tillich, is how the symbolically expressed ideas of God as spirit and of the living God are to be understood. In contrast to Nietzsche, he writes, for whom God is life, we must say that God is the living God because he is spirit. This makes an important point, but the point is not that God is a spiritual being for Tillich after all. Rather, it makes the idea of God the supreme symbol of the kind of meaning and power conjoining and elaborating phenomenon that Tillich calls spirituality. So he goes on to say, God as spirit is the ultimate unity of power and meaning. If spirit is so conceived, however, this is not in contrast to Nietzsche at all. It actually very nicely expresses an important part of Nietzsche's own conception of the divine, which his kind of religiousness celebrates. The transformation of mere life into spirituality, involving the generation of meaning by way of what Nietzsche calls sublimation and value creation, is something that Nietzsche considers to be of the utmost significance. And they both agree that this phenomenon is to be understood as a transfiguration of the natural, rather than as an injection into the natural of something supernatural. But Tillich does more than emphasize the significance of the element of rationality or of meaning. He further stresses the point that there is something about being itself, or the power of being, that warrants the idea of their victory. It is this that he thinks Nietzsche misses. And here at last we may be getting to the heart of the matter. For Nietzsche insists that both sides of the coin of power, creation and destruction, must be affirmed, precisely because it is a single coin, which must be affirmed in its fundamental unity if it is to be affirmed at all. The fundamental unity and inseparability of these two sides, both creative and destructive, is what the later Nietzsche used the notion of the Dionysian to symbolize. He would regard Tillich's idea of, this is Tillich's phrase, the victory of the element of rationality or of meaning over their opposites, as a piece of wishful thinking that we must learn to live without. On the other hand, Nietzsche does not simply reject the associated underlying sensibility, which cherishes this element of order establishment and significance endowment. He seizes instead upon the thought of structure and meaning as eternally recurring possibilities in this life and this world, and incorporates this thought and its celebration into his kind of religiousness, right along with the recognition of their contingency and transience, which we must likewise learn to be able to love and affirm. Neither creation nor destruction has the last word for Nietzsche. Rather, he takes the last word to belong to the idea that both will recur eternally. Tillich rightly recognizes that the key to Nietzsche's kind of religiousness is thus, as he says, the famous idea of the eternal return. Tillich cites the hyperbolic version of this idea that Nietzsche does at times employ, according to which, as Tillich puts it, everything that happens an infinite number of times. The version that we find in 1067 and often elsewhere is much looser than that. But the general point for present purposes is that for Nietzsche, eternal recurrence is the only sort of eternity there is. What hallows each moment for him is nothing more or less than its significance as a moment of such recurrence, its ephemerality notwithstanding. For Tillich, on the other hand, this is not enough. He wants to be able to say, he does say, that the moment is eternal by virtue of what he describes as the presence of eternal life in it. The problem Tillich faces is to be able to explicate the notion, to explicate the difference meaningfully, without having to help himself to a more robust conception of eternal life than his reinterpretation of the idea of God as being itself will permit. Be that as it may, it is clear that both Tillich and Nietzsche envision a post-theistic future, not only for the idea of God, but also for a conjoined future of religiousness, even if not the same sorts of religiousness that have long been associated with commonplace belief in that sort of God. Indeed, they consider it not only to be possible, but important that religiousness of the right sort survive or arise subsequent to the death of God, theistically conceived. Nietzsche's approach was revolutionary, while Tillich's was evolutionary, but both sought to midwife the transition in a manner that would not leave humanity bereft of all religious sensibility after the death of God finally sinks in. But what kind or kinds of religiousness do they have in mind? It's with that question that the rest of my talk will be concerned. Religion, Tillich tells us in The Courage to Be, is the state of being grasped by the power of being itself. And faith, he writes, is the existential acceptance of something transcending ordinary experience. But what is that? Well, what faith means, Tillich explains, must be understood through the courage to be. And he continues, the courage to be is the self-affirmation of being in spite of non-being. Faith is the experience of this power. It is in this way that Tillich is to be understood when he talks about absolute faith, which he says transcends the theistic idea of God and has nothing to do with belief in such a God. Tillich's post-theistic religiousness, like Nietzsche's, thus focuses upon the transformation and enhancement of life. It revolves around the power and self-affirmation of what it means or can mean to be in this world, rather than around something beyond it. This kind of religiousness does involve connecting with a kind of power that transcends our own particular individual existence. Tillich calls that power the power of being itself. His kind of religiousness has as its main focus and content the fostering and cultivation of our sense of that power, and the living of life in a manner imbued with it and sustained by it. So he writes near the end of The Courage to Be, if the self participates in the power of being itself, it receives itself back. For the power of being acts through the power of the individual selves. Unquote. The animation, illumination, and intensification of our lives and relationships, both mundane and in moments of crisis, is what this power and action are all about, and is the true and proper focus of Tillich's kind of religiousness. Nietzsche hints at his preferred type of religiousness in a late note, in which he writes that there is one type of religious person, which he calls the pagan, not conceived as primitive and barbaric, but rather as, here's what Nietzsche's definition is, the type of a well-turned-out and ecstatic overflowing spirit, whose religiousness is a form of thanksgiving and affirmation of life. Nietzsche continues, it is here that I locate the Dionysus of the Greeks. I can't help but think of Tillich saying, Dionysus. The religious affirmation of life, life as a whole, not divided or denied. It is Nietzsche's affinity for this type of religiousness that leads Tillich to speak of his ecstatic naturalism. It finds striking expression in the last two sections of Part 3 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, with their two great life-affirming love songs to eternity. Both versions differ greatly from what we usually think of, both, that is, Tillich's and Nietzsche's versions, differ greatly from what we usually think of as religiousness. But that, it seems to me, is all to the good. Some will see no point in any sort of religiousness if there is no God whose wrath is to be feared and whose favor may be curried, and if there is no possibility of real pie in the sky when you die by and by. Nietzsche and Tillich are not for them. For those who get past this way of thinking, however, Nietzsche and Tillich are ready and waiting. Perhaps I should say a little more about the kind of post-theistic religiousness toward which I take Nietzsche to have been moving, since it is not obvious what I am talking about. I believe it to have real possibilities. I shall then bring Tillich back into the discussion, but shall leave it an open question whether this may be, or may not be, where Tillich's path may ultimately lead. The basic issue, I suggest, to which religiousness is a response, is that of the relation of human beings to the reality of which we are a part. How we understand this relation and how we feel about it makes a great deal of difference to creatures like ourselves, who must live with the burden of self-consciousness and the capacity for reflection, and who are aware of their own mortality. Religions minister to our need for assistance in understanding this relation and coming to terms with what befalls us. They might be said to be in the consciousness transformation business, fostering forms of identity and identification, providing interpretations, and cultivating sensibilities. So they may also be said to be in the value generation and revaluation business. They are more than interpretive. They also specialize in the expression, affirmation, elaboration, and promotion of values of various sorts, thereby transforming human life and helping to endow and infuse it with value and values it would not otherwise have. But it seems to Nietzsche that religions have often done this in ways that have been more detrimental than beneficial to human life. He looks to a form of religiousness that would contribute powerfully to the enhancement of human life. The affirmation of life is no less crucial to the possibility of its enhancement for Nietzsche than the prospect of its enhancement is crucial to its affirmation. From The Birth of Tragedy onward, that's Nietzsche's first book, Nietzsche takes the key to its affirmation to be learning to experience it as valuable, not by virtue of its relation to anything beyond this world, or owing to its satisfaction of some independently specifiable value standard, but rather on its own terms, either for what it is or for what it is capable of becoming. The development of this sensibility is the great achievement and power of the various forms of art as Nietzsche distinguishes and discusses them in that first book, Apollinian, Dionysian, and tragic. And that, I believe, he also understood, is what religiousness likewise can and should be fundamentally about. A religious sensibility of any of these three sorts must be acquired and cultivated. It is only for the properly transformed and attuned consciousness that things not only exist but matter, and bear aspects that enable us to cherish them. To come to experience them in this way, as valuable, estimable, admirable, enables one to affirm and celebrate them, and with them, the life and world of which they are a part. And such celebration in turn reinforces and promotes the experience of them as valuable. This, I believe, is the vital core of the kind of religiousness I am talking about. Nietzsche takes it to have been a pre-theistic reality and believes it to be a post-theistic possibility. A crucial piece of the puzzle of how this can work has to do with the phenomenon of identification. As long as one experiences something as alien to one's own identity and existence, the affirmation and celebration of it will be difficult, if not impossible. If life and the world are to be affirmed and celebrated, one must learn to understand and experience both them and oneself under some persuasive description that facilitates identification in a sustaining, satisfying, and even exhilarating manner, with something fundamental about them that is felt to matter more than any and all of their distressing aspects. That is a tall order. But Nietzsche and Tillich share the conviction that it can be filled, if the right thing about them is selected, and the right sensibility is attained. The problem is to come up with something other than any particular existing being or kind of being. It needs to be something worthy of being made the focus of what Tillich calls ultimate concern, worthy of unconditional affirmation, identification, and celebration, and capable of sustaining such an embrace without corruption ensuing on the part either of their subjects or their object. And that rules us out as individuals and as a species. We cannot be that object of our own ultimate concern. True religiousness happens when something is experienced as divine. Religious pathologies occur when this experience is misplaced and takes as its object something incapable of sustaining so high a valuation. The right choice for Tillich is the power of being, conceived as disposed to express itself creatively in a manner conducive to the development and triumph of coherent meaningfulness. For Nietzsche, instead of the power of being, it might be described as the becoming of power. Understood, however, not as any particular instance of power, but rather as the name of the creative, destructive game the world eternally plays with itself. God, the supreme power, Nietzsche wrote in a late note, discussing various concepts of God. That suffices. Everything follows from it. The world follows from it. End of that short quotation, but I'm going to read it again. God, the supreme power, that suffices. Everything follows from it. The world follows from it. Nietzsche's choice makes Tillich nervous. Power, unconstrained by some sort of principle of rationality and meaning, is for Tillich more demonic than divine. But Tillich's choice would strike Nietzsche as being at once too thin and too wishful, for to his way of thinking, there is no such constraint of rationality and meaningfulness, either in the world's fundamental nature or beyond it. And so we had best come to terms with that circumstance and cultivate our sensibility accordingly. Doing so, however, need not, for Nietzsche, mean fixing upon the most simplistic version of what it means to exist in such a world. How might one think about the reality of which we are a part in such a way that it can be seen and experienced as divine no less than as demonic, with a Nietzschean sensibility? What might one fix upon that admits of being experienced without illusion as making it all worthwhile? The two most obvious general alternatives would appear to be either something elemental about life in the world or something developmental about them. The former sort of religiousness, modeled on Nietzsche's early conception of the Dionysian, may be thought of as centering upon the affirmation and celebration of vitality itself, as Tillich observes, and of the associated basic forces and phenomena associated with it, such as sexuality, birth, and death. The latter, on the other hand, the developmental option, modeled on Nietzsche's alternate conception of the Apollinean, may be conceived as focusing more upon that which they have it in them to become, and upon the realization of that potentiality, valorizing and celebrating things like Tillich's rationality and meaning in particular. But Nietzsche does not stop with these two types alone in his analysis of the arts of the Greeks. He goes on to discern a third, the tragic, which he considers to transcend them both. And I take him likewise to envision a third sort of post-theistic religiousness that is at once deeply tragic and profoundly affirmative. Tragedy, as conceived by Nietzsche and the Greeks, transcends pessimism no less than optimism, and represents one of the greatest achievements of the human spirit, finding a way to a powerful affirmation of life even in the face of the worst that can befall us. Their transfiguration, the contingency and vulnerability and ephemerality and even self-destructiveness of all such transfigured existence notwithstanding, and indeed as a part of what makes that existence so admirable and sublime. It is this sensibility that the later Nietzsche calls Dionysian. There is an entry in one of Nietzsche's late notebooks from the last year of his productive life that bears the heading, The Two Types, Dionysus and the Crucified. I have already cited a part of this note. Here's some more of it. Dionysus versus the Crucified, Nietzsche writes. There you have the antithesis. It is not a difference with respect to martyrdom. Rather, the same thing has a different meaning. Stopping the quote for the moment. Dionysian religiousness, Nietzsche explains, revolves around the idea that, quoting again, life itself, its eternal fruitfulness and recurrence, give rise to torment, destruction, the will to annihilation. Whereas, in the other case, suffering, the crucified as the innocent, is taken to be an objection against life, as a formula for its condemnation. Now consider what Nietzsche says next. The problem is that of the meaning of life, whether a Christian meaning or a tragic meaning. In the first case, the Christian case is Nietzsche's understanding Christianity, it is supposed to be the way to a blessed state of being. Ultimately, that state of being is taken to be blessed enough to be able to justify a monstrous amount of suffering. In the second case, however, by virtue of the attainment of a genuine tragic sensibility, Nietzsche writes, the tragic human being affirms even the harshest suffering. He is strong, full, deifying enough to do so. Dionysus, cut in pieces, is a promise of life. It will ever be born again and come back from destruction. End of quote. This may seem to be a far cry from Tillich's kind of religiousness. And yet, one must have a keen ear not to hear an overtone of the note Nietzsche sounds here when Tillich proclaims that, as he puts it in systematic theology, God is the power of being resisting and conquering non-being. And in the courage to be, being must be thought as the negation of being. That is why we describe being best by the metaphor power of being. Indeed, Tillich even goes so far as to say, being includes non-being, and through non-being it reveals itself. But what is this if not essentially the same idea that Nietzsche seeks to express through his insistence upon the fundamental interconnectedness and inseparability of creation and destruction, both of which are manifestations of the power that makes the world go round? Tillich undoubtedly would want to disavow the kind of Christianity to which Nietzsche here contrasts his Dionysianism, a Christianity which disvalues this life and this world except as a rite of passage to a purportedly available and infinitely preferable radical alternative state of being beyond them. The new being Tillich's kind of religiousness is intended to foster and celebrate is very much a way of being in this life and in this world, and the kind of eternity in which it participates is the eternity of the transfigured here and now, imbued with the courage to be that is the self-affirmation of being in spite of non-being. That seems to me to be not so very different from the religiousness that Nietzsche calls Dionysian. It is small wonder, therefore, that Tillich is much more comfortable with Nietzsche than he is with so many other thinkers. He knew Nietzsche to be at bottom a kindred spirit, religiously as well as intellectually. And I believe they both understood something that could well turn out to be of great importance, humanly as well as religiously speaking. The death of God, theistically conceived, far from closing the book on religiousness, may merely mark the ending of one of its chapters, and the beginning of another, in which it is the things they both seek to articulate out of their senses of the de-reified divine that takes stage front and center, displacing disputes and fantasies about God, the soul, and immortality. Nietzsche and Tillich did their best to help us turn that page and to see how we might get on with the next chapter. We live in a time in which most people would seem to prefer otherwise. But getting on with the next chapter is important, for sooner or later it is going to be needed. They both knew that. And that is one of the reasons why we still need them. I could leave it at that, and maybe I should, but I'm not going to. I would like to conclude, as I began, on a personal note. Tillich's departure for Chicago at the end of my junior year was traumatic for all of us who considered him to be our master educator. But even his departure turned out to be memorable and meaningful to me. As a member of the inner group of Tillich groupies, I had the honor of helping him pack up his books and papers in his office in Widener when he was getting ready to leave. And to commemorate the occasion, he inscribed in my copy of The Courage to Be as follows: Paul Tillich, gratefully, for help in moving the spirit. June 8th, 1962. Well, I would like to think that in a sense and in my own way, that is what I have been doing ever since, trying to help in moving the spirit, which sometimes means, as it did then, helping it to move on. My way has diverged from his, at least in some respects, but it is a way he enabled me to find. And if I am right about him and what I have been saying today, I may not have diverged all that far. Thank you very much. Thank you. If we have time for it, sure.
There's time for a few questions, discussion here. And if you do ask a question, please do speak up. We don't have microphones out in the audience. It's a big room.
And if you need to go, don't hesitate to do so. It's quite all right. Yes.
I have several questions, all of which in some ways you answered, and yet not quite. The first one, in terms of his
Which his?
being,
Tillich. Okay.
the question about Tillich is, where does it stand as compared to Spinoza's Deus sive natura, God equivalent to nature? And in some ways, I'm not clear to what extent is he saying the same thing. The second question, if I may,
Okay.
has to do with Kant's critique, the Reinhard Kandun's critique, and his antinomies, where he makes it very clear, I think, at least to some of us, that he can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God. And in his famous statement in his introduction to the critique, he says, I criticize reason to make faith for faith. And therefore, basically, looks like Tillich is dealing with that part of faith. Therefore, the meaning, the rationality is beyond. Friedrich's question is this: is Tillich more than a theologian? Very important one. In what sense is he a philosopher?
Okay, first about Spinoza. It's I could give a whole lecture on this one. Spinoza was one of Tillich's heroes. And interestingly, Spinoza was also one of Hegel's heroes and one of Nietzsche's heroes. And you could tell a different story about the history of modern philosophy if you told it with Spinoza as the starting point rather than Descartes, and with Hegel and Nietzsche as latter-day followers of Spinoza. But there is a significant difference. And what Tillich said about that was that although Spinoza was trying for the right sort of all-encompassing conception of being in the ground of being, he couldn't get away from the idea of being as substance. And that was a fundamental conceptual barrier to his making the transition to a non-substantial conception of being. And so you have Spinoza maintaining not just that God is a being, but he is the ultimate being. He is the being that includes everything. And Tillich wants to say, no, he's not a being at all. We need a conception of reality that encompasses all of reality, but does not turn it into attributes of a being. So he thought that Spinoza's conception needed to be, as it were, translated into a different idiom, but Spinoza was definitely on the right track. And I don't know if you know this, perhaps you do. He so respected and admired Spinoza that he thought for some time of trying to do systematic theology in the way that Spinoza wrote his ethics, with axioms and theorems and proofs and the whole rest of it. I mean, thank goodness he didn't do that, but the admiration for Spinoza went that far. In the case of Kant, there is more distance there. Kant's mistake, Tillich thought, was to think that even though that it's still meaningful to talk about proving and disproving the existence of God. Kant should have understood that the whole issue is bogus, not because you can't prove it and you can't disprove it, but because you shouldn't even think about God as existing beyond the ability to prove it. So that Kant still had the thought of the existence of God, and it was a very important thought for Kant indeed. Kant still, at least as Tillich understood him, holds on to the idea of God as a being who's got a very powerful role indeed to play beyond this life and in this world in terms of the sort of prospects that different ones of us may face. So his rational faith is very different from what Tillich means by faith, which completely gets away from the idea of belief in a being of any sort. And he thinks that Kant's faith still did involve belief in a being, in fact, a variety of kinds of beings, things in themselves of various kinds, including our souls, things in themselves. Should have just gotten that whole terminology out and thought about ourselves differently. So I don't say that Tillich had that he was a superior philosopher to either one of them, but he had a line on both of them, and you wanted to know what it was, and so that's what it was. Yes.
How would you characterize Heidegger's view of being? Would you characterize it as a religiousness in the same way that Tillich's is, and how would you compare the two?
If you think Tillich is bad on being, I mean, Heidegger is a lot worse. That in terms of trying to figure out what he means and his never being willing to even come close to making it clear. Heidegger actually makes a big issue about being so obscured and so beclouded by the history of Western philosophy and by language and so forth that we don't even have a chance of understanding what it is. So it's true that Tillich's notion of being itself has a kind of affinity with the use that Heidegger makes of the notion of being. Both of them say that whatever being it is not a being. That is, being with a big B or something like that is not a being, and that it is to be understood dynamically rather than substantially, like being. But Heidegger is not willing to go even as far as Tillich is in trying to supply us with metaphors and symbols, talk of power, ground, and things of that nature, to try to give us a handle on the sort of characteristic of the reality of which we're a part, to which attention is to be directed. It may be that if it hadn't been for Heidegger, that Tillich would have talked about something other than being itself. I mean, I'm quite sure that he used that language because he was attempting to use something like the language of the philosophy of our time, and Heidegger was the greatest exponent of what he thought was the philosophy of our time, namely existenz philosophy. And he thought that what Heidegger was trying to do by trying to get us to stop thinking about the nature of reality in terms of a collection of kinds of particular entities. That was a good idea, and that being is something, there is an important sense of being in which you can't use that model, that substance or entity paradigm for it. So I think he tried to do something more intelligible than Heidegger did with the notion of being, that would incorporate whatever might be important in the shift that Heidegger is trying to get us to make, but will do so in a way that enables us to understand something about the kind of answer to which his sort of religiousness gives to the Heideggerian question of the meaning of being and of the meaning of our own existence as well. That's about the best I can do. Yes, first.
This should be our last question.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was thinking, in light of your ending of the way prior, what do you think? Do you think that the post-structuralists have made a contribution to that? Do you think of Deleuze or Derrida, they were probably more deep in
Well, it may be that they have contributed to the de-reification of our thinking about things, but I do not think that, and I don't think Tillich would think that they've done so in a very helpful way, because at least I'll speak for a Tillichian way, but I think I'll speak also in a Nietzschean way. Both Tillich and Nietzsche thought that it is important to be as clear, as precise, as rational as it is possible to be in our discussion of things as difficult as those we're talking about here. And the post-structuralists seem to delight in a kind of irresponsibility when it comes to rationality and clarity in their discussion. It's as though they wish to deconstruct the very idea of rational discourse. And that's taking de-reification too far. And so I think that if you're going to locate thinkers like Tillich and Nietzsche, you should put them on the side of analytical philosophy rather than post-structuralist philosophy. Doing our best to get as clear as we can about things that are very difficult to talk about is what they were doing, and that's analytical rather than deconstructionist in intention. Well, again, thank you very much.